In this screencast, I want to go ahead and take a look at structuring a web page and specifically the different elements that we might have within the structure of a web page. So up until this point, we've dealt with kind of the basics of how do we create an HTML page so that it'll render in a browser. But really, this is kind of the next step of that in terms of how I could logically organize a page that's going to have different sections of content and how that can be organized in a thoughtful and meaningful way so that your site makes sense. So first thing I want to do is I want to create a folder on my desktop for this project. So if I'm going to skip over to the Finder window, I'm going to have a new Finder window. It'll open on my desktop. I'll create my new folder. I'm just going to call this Page Organization. Okay, and then what I want to do is inside of there, I want to have a couple of different web pages. So we know already that with Atom, I'm going to add that project folder so that I can see it on the left-hand side. So here's my page organization folder. And then I want to have a couple of subdirectories underneath it. So I'm going to have a new folder for my web pages. I'm going to have a new folder for my style sheets. And then I'm going to have a new folder for my images. Okay, so this is kind of the structure that we're going to have. And then within web pages, I want to have a new file. And I'm going to name it index.html. Okay, so this is our HTML file. And from the last screencast, we know that we have some nice things that are built into Atom that are going to make our life easier as a developer. So one of those things that we have as a developer is the idea of IntelliSense and auto-completion and code completion. So I'm going to take advantage of that right now. So I'm going to start with an HTML template. So I type in the word HTML and hit enter, and it automatically fills in this HTML template for me. And up until this point, this has kind of been our focus. Like, how do I generate this template? What are the required tags within my HTML document to create a HTML page? We've looked a little bit at relative paths and things like that, but now I want to take it a step further. So we have a web page, our template's generated for us, and now we want to start putting some content together so that our site makes sense. Okay, so we want to have a basic page title, so demo page organization. And we still are going to have these same tags. So we're going to have our head section along with any external references and a title. We're going to have our body section. That's where all of our HTML content's going to go. We're going to have beginning and ending tags for all of those things. But now when we're looking at our page, I want to add some additional detail. So at the top of our page, it might be nice to have a navigation bar. Okay, so I might be able to go to my home page, I might be able to go to an About Us, a Contact Us, all of those different pages. So at the top of our page, I want to have some navigation links. And for now, I'm just going to use internet links that are publicly accessible on the internet, but they could be links to pages within our site. So I want to start with a navigation bar. So I'm going to have beginning and ending nav tags. And then inside these nav tags, I want to go ahead and have hyperlinks out to different web pages. Okay, so for instance, let's say I wanted to just have a link out to various text editors. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a demo on various text editors. Okay, so I'm going to have an anchor tag that's going to allow me to link out to an external site. The external site reference is going to be in this href tag, or this href attribute, sorry, not tag. I don't want to mistake terminology. And the first editor that we're using is Atom, so that'll be our first link. We could also use a different text editor, so if you're more comfortable with Notepad++, we could have that editor. We could also have, I'm drawing a blank, Visual Studio Code. And right now, the way these hyperlinks are set up is we have some text, and then we have what should be a clickable link. Okay, the text is going to be a clickable link. And then this href is when I click on the clickable link, where do I actually navigate to? Okay, so we'll fill in the details on these hrefs. They're going to be URLs. For now, I want to use the Atom Live server, and I'm going to start it up, and we should be able to see our page. So under Web Pages, here's our page, and you'll notice that I have these hyperlinks, and the hyperlinks right now don't go anywhere. They just stay where they are. So I click on one, I don't go anywhere, and that's because I don't have that href attribute supplied. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my bookmarks bar. I want to fill in the hyperlink href attribute for each of these editors. So if I were to download Atom, I do a search for the Atom text editor, here's a link to the Atom text editor. Okay, so I go out, I have a URL, that's going to be my href attribute. So I just plug that in, just copied and pasted it from the browser address bar over to my href attribute. Okay, then I want to do the same thing for Notepad++. Okay, so here's a link to Notepad++. It's another fine text editor. I'm going to go ahead and plug that into the href attribute for Notepad++. And then I want to do the same thing for Visual Studio Code. So here's a link to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to plug that link in. Okay, so now I have that saved, and I go back over to my page. So now I'm on my page. If I click on Visual Studio Code, you can see down here in the bottom left-hand side of the window, you can see that it's actually a hyperlink to a different destination. So if I click on that, it'll take me to Visual Studio Code. If I click on the Notepad++ link, it'll take me there. If I click on the Atom link, it'll take me there. Okay, so just kind of a brief overview of what these hyperlinks are going to do. I could also have a hyperlink that's linking somewhere within my site, and then I wouldn't have to fully qualify it. I'll give you one example of that. Okay, so here's a new file. It's going to be demo.html. Okay, and I'm going to use that HTML template, and I'm just going to say that this is a dummy page under construction. Okay, so this page is under construction, and now I can use that page as a hyperlink. So my href is going to be demo.html, and here's my demo page. That's the text that shows up. And now if we go back over to our website, and I'm going to reload that, you'll see demo pages here. If I click on it, it'll take me over to my dummy page that's under construction. So I can have links that are owned by me within my site, and then I can also have links that are to external destinations. So right now we have a link to Atom, to Notepad++, to Visual Studio Code, and then we have our fourth link, which is to a page that we own, that we've created. It's relative to our site. Okay, so you'll notice that we use the same anchor tags. The only difference is that we don't have to fully qualify that path. We give it a relative path to that page. Notice what I didn't do. I did not use this address, the 127.001:3000 web pages demo.html. This URL only exists on my computer. So if I move this, so let's say I wanted to host it and I was going to buy a hosting package and I move all my HTML files out there. Once I move them, this URL does not exist. This URL is not going to exist on whatever web host that I choose. So this URL is just for my local machine. So don't use that. Use a relative path. Okay. So moving forward, we're talking about how do I organize a page. So at the top, we might have a navigation bar. We might have that on the left-hand side of our page or the right-hand side of the page or the footer or wherever. But at this point, we're assuming that we have our nav bar at the very top. Then, after the nav bar, we might have some main content. So we're just organizing this. This is going to be our main content. And then, lastly, we might close this page off with a footer. Okay, so we have different sections of our site. Okay, so we have our navigation, we have our main, we have our footer, and then within this, typically our navigation bar is just going to be navigation links. Within the main, we can have any sorts of HTML tags. So we've talked about some. We've talked about some block elements, divs, paragraphs, headings. So we talked about some of those block elements. We've talked about some inline elements, so our spans, our images, our form tags. But what I really want to focus on today is lists. Okay, so within our main content, I'm going to have a couple of different types of lists that we could create. And really, the gist of this video is focused on how do I organize a page to make it readable. But as a subset of that, I also want to focus on a new content item, which is a list. Okay, so I can create an unordered list. So there's no order to this, it's just an unordered list. So I might say that I want an h2 tag unordered lists. I'm closing h2. The way I get an unordered list is I use a ul tag, so that's to signify that I'm dealing with an unordered list. And then within that list, I'm going to have list items, and I'm going to create list items using li tags. Okay, so I might say that this is my grocery list. Okay, and I'm not going to put it in any particular order. So milk, pizza, bread, butter. Okay, so this is my grocery list. It's an unordered list. It's an unordered list because I started with that UL. And you'll notice that if I go back to my page and reload it, I have this unordered list that's just a bulleted list. And there's different styles that I can use with this. So I could use bullets, I can use stars, I can use squares. So again, if you want to see those, so if I do unordered list style, okay, so CSS styling, unordered lists. So here's a couple of variations of unordered lists. We have the circles, we have squares. The list style type identifies the marker. Okay, so the list style type, I can use circle, I can use square. There's many more. So I don't necessarily want to get into those list style types, but that's how I'm changing those styles. Okay, so if we wanted to do that, so right now the default is just a bulleted list. If we want to have a variation in the style of our list item, I'm going to go ahead and add a style sheet. So here's master.css. And what I want to do is I want to take my unordered list and I want to set the list style type to be square. Okay, and if I go back over to my browser, you'll see that that doesn't actually happen yet. So if I refresh this, it's still these bullets, these circled bullets. If I actually want this to work, I have to make sure that my web page knows about my style sheet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a link, and I use that code completion to indicate that we're talking about a style sheet named master.css. So now I have a reference to that style sheet, and now I head back over and you'll notice that my bulleted list is now stars. Okay, and you'll see the other variations. So we could use circle. Okay, it's another option that we could use. So if we come over here and we say circle, now you'll notice that I have circles for my list style type. So there's variations on that. Let's say I wanted to get multiple types of pizza. Okay, so I have this unordered list. I want pizza, but then I want multiple types of pizza. So I'm specific about my frozen pizzas. Let's say I want to have another unordered list specifying the different types of frozen pizza that I want to buy. So I'm going to have another unordered list, and the list items for that would be Jack's, pepperoni, Red Baron, cheese, and DiGiorno, rising crust sausage. Okay, so I have different types of pizza, and really what I'm illustrating here is that I can have nested lists. Okay, if I didn't have any style rules applied, so if I come back over and I say I don't want to have any style rules applied, so I comment out my style rule, then you'll notice that the style rules, what ends up happening is that my page gets rendered, and then we'll have list style types that are different across the different lists. So since this list is embedded in the other list, it knows that. And this is more relevant when we have an ordered list, but you'll notice that the list style type changes from kind of the traditional bullet to just circles. Okay, so our unordered list, we can have as many items as we want. We identify the items using these li tags, and then within the li tags we can even have another list, so we can have lists within lists. Okay, then we can have the concept of an ordered list. Okay, so I always like to think of your classes that you have to take at Madison College to get a degree. So if I'm going to take the sequence of courses to lead to the web software developer associate degree, then I have to take those in a specific order. So if I'm looking at this, I'm going to have some list items, and now we have an ordered list because we're starting with an OL as opposed to a UL. For instance, you might be taking the HTML class, and that's the 10-152-120 course. So you're in that. You might also be taking the JavaScript class. You might also be taking the database class. Okay, and I'm just going to leave the course numbers the same. Okay, so if I'm looking at this ordered list, you'll notice that these are numbered 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then as you get into the second semester, you might take the advanced JavaScript, and then you might take the SQL class, and then you might take the advanced website course. Okay, so now you'll see they're numbered 1 through 6. Okay, so our ordered list. I can also do some CSS styling tricks to our ordered list. You'll notice the different types of lists that we could have: lower alpha, upper Roman. Let's say I wanted to have lowercase letters for my list. Okay, so then if I come back over to my style sheet, I'm going to go ahead and put my first style rule back in play. So I'm going to uncomment that. And then I'm going to say that my ordered list style type should be lower alpha. Okay, now you'll notice it's lettered A through F as opposed to numbered 1 through 6. Okay, so two different types of lists. If I care about order, then I want to use an ordered list. If I don't care about order, then I'm going to use an unordered list. The last type of list that we're going to talk about for this example is a description list. So I'm going to go ahead and say, here's a description list. And the idea with a description list is that I might have a term, and then within that term, I would have a definition for that term. So really just kind of a term and a definition. So in our case, let's go ahead and have a couple of terms. So we're going to have our description list, so our DL. So there's our description list. And then within the description list, each list item is really two things. It's the kind of name of our element, if you will. So let's say we're talking about baseball team. So I say, here's the Milwaukee Brewers, closing DT. And then we're going to have our data definition. So data term, data definition. Best team in the NL Central. And then we might have another, so DT, Chicago Cubs, closing DT, DD, worst team in the world, and then DT, St. Louis Cardinals. That's our term, and then our definition. Another awful team in the NL Central. Closing DD. Okay, so that's going to be our description list, and you'll notice how this gets rendered. So we have the Brewers, and then our data definition. We have the Cubs, our definition, Cardinals, and our definition. So this is known as a description list. And really it's just a different type of list that we might have. Okay? Now, we could decide that each one of these things belongs in its own kind of grouping. So in our last video I showed you how I could group things, and it was really kind of a quick thing where I could group form elements, and I could group form elements by using an article, or I'm sorry, a div tag. And instead what I want to do is I want to use an article to kind of create a grouping. So I'm grouping all of my lists inside of an article. And you'll notice how I fixed the indenting there. So I'm holding down the shift key and then I'm arrowing down to highlight all of the different rows as opposed to kind of just dragging and dropping over elements. So I have an article, and then I might have different sections within the article. So my first section might be for unordered lists. So here's my first section for unordered lists. And then my second section for ordered lists. And again, I'm highlighting all of that so I can indent properly. Closing section. And then another section for my description list. And I'm going to go ahead and indent that properly and close off that section. So within all of this, I'm saying my page itself, everything in it, is really this HTML page. We have our beginning and ending HTML tag, and we know that we're going to have a head and body. But then inside of it, now I'm starting to give context to all of the different elements. I'm saying that this is kind of one big article, and the article is talking about these three different types of lists. So I have three different sections for my lists, and I'm just organizing the page a little bit better. Okay, and the idea there is that I'm giving context to all of the things that I'm outputting on the screen. So as I decide what I want to put on the screen, I decide also how I want to organize that. And the organization's a huge piece. It's a huge piece to you as a developer, but it's also a huge piece to other developers that are going to be working with you, so they can see, like, this is kind of the structure of the page. This is how it's going to work. This is how it's put together. Now I know where, if I need to add content, I kind of know where that content is going to fit in. Okay, so if I need to add a new item on my grocery list, I know that that was in the first section on unordered lists, and I got to add a new list item here. Okay, so that's kind of an easy thing. Or if a class gets replaced, I know, oh, that's in the second grouping of ordered lists, and then I can pick and choose which class I want to add or modify or whatever I want to do. Okay, same thing goes for the idea of how we're organizing our projects and our pages with folder structure. So I know that if I have an image, that image is going to go into my images folder. I know if I have some styling rules, those styling rules are going to go into my style sheet. Okay. Okay, so then the last thing that I really want to touch on is the idea of some attributes. So one of the attributes that we will deal with throughout the semester is an ID. So with this navigation, I know that this is the only navigation that I have on the page. And if I want to style this navigation, or if I want to add some style rules for this navigation, I can go ahead and do that by using an ID attribute. Here's my nav bar. That's how I'm going to identify that navigation object. Okay, whereas let's say I wanted to style some lists. So for instance, this unordered list and my ordered list, I want to style those two things. I'm going to call them styled lists. So I want the same rules applied to both my ordered list and unordered list. Okay, and so like obviously that's going to rule out the list style type because I'm styling them differently. But I want some rules to be applied the same way. So for instance, maybe I want to set the width on those elements, or maybe I want to set the background color on those lists. Okay, so I want to apply a rule to both my ordered list and unordered list. Okay, so I can't use an ID to do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a class attribute. Okay, so this is going to be my styled list. And then I'm going to use that same class identifier for my ordered list. So class equal to styled list. Okay. Now, since I know that I want to do some styling for my nav bar, and then I'm going to do some styling for my list, let's focus on the nav bar first, and we can just kind of refresh what that looks like. Right now it looks fairly bad, right? So it's just these hyperlinks. What I want to do is I want to style this a little bit. So I want to take my nav bar and I want to fix the spacing. So I'm going to take the nav bar, and the way I'm going to select the nav bar in CSS is I use this pound sign. The pound sign says I want to style an element that has an ID of nav bar. So the pound sign in CSS correlates to the ID attribute in HTML. So I take that nav bar and let me set the width to 100%. Okay, so then I refresh the page. You'll notice that the width doesn't change. Okay, so this goes back to the last screencast that we did where we were talking about inline elements versus block elements. Okay, and the idea here is that you'll notice that all of the anchor tags that we have, so Atom, Notepad++, Visual Studio Code, demo page, those elements are inline elements. They don't cause the text to word wrap. It doesn't create a new line. So I know that they're inline elements. And one of the things with inline elements is they don't have a width. Width doesn't make sense for inline elements. And the reason for that is inline elements only take up the space that they need. Okay? So those are inline elements. So now I have an issue. So I have this nav bar. I want it to take up the full width of the screen. So what I can do is I can say that I want this to be an inline block element. Okay, so now I refresh this. I'm still not getting the width that I want. Why am I not getting the width that I want? Bar width 100%. Okay, so we want the nav bar width to 100%. We have the display set up as an inline block, and as we're seeing in our page, the hyperlinks are not taking up the full width of the page. So let's dig a little bit deeper And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to put a border around the nav bar. So now you'll see that the nav bar is taking up 100% width. And what the issue we're having is that these hyperlinks are inline elements. So let's go ahead and take care of some of that. So we want to say the nav bar hyperlinks. And again, this is a little bit more advanced CSS. Our selector is, we're going into the nav bar and we're selecting all of the anchor tags in the nav bar. We're going to set that display to inline block. And then we can set a width on those elements. So the width, we have 4 of them. Let's make it 25%. We don't get the full 100%. So you'll notice that we have the word wrap there. So instead of using 25%, let's use 20%. And now you'll notice that those hyperlinks are spanning across the page. Not exactly the way we want them to be linked together. And the reason why is if we dig a little bit deeper, so let's dig a little bit deeper, we're going to take the border off of the nav bar and apply them to the anchor tags. So the borders off the nav bar applied to the anchor tags within the nav bar. So you'll notice that we're taking up 80% of the width of the screen, so 20 for each of the hyperlinks. But then the hyperlinks themselves are left justified to the block that it's taking up. So we can align these hyperlinks using text align, and I'm going to center them. And now our nav bar looks a little bit cleaner. It's distributed across the top of the page. Okay, so we're using inline block elements. And the idea with an inline block element is we don't have the word wrap, so it's not going to take up all the space, but it does allow us to set a width. So those inline elements are treated kind of as a hybrid block element. And that's what that display equaling inline block is that we're using here in our style sheet. Okay, secondarily, we wanted to style our style sheets, or I'm sorry, our lists. We have these styled lists. So we have the class for our unordered list. We have the class for our ordered list. I want to style both of them. The way I select both of them is I use that class selector. So I'm saying I want this style rule to apply to any element that that has this class. The way I do that is I say I have the styled list, and now all of these style rules will apply to any element that has that class. So the dot is an indication that we're talking about a class selector. So we can just go ahead and change the background to some color. So let's say we choose like cornflower blue. Okay, so now you'll notice that our lists are a different color. And then we can go further. So just kind of like we did with the nav bar, we can say, I want to take that styled list, and I'm talking about any list item inside of it, and I can change the background to a different color. So now I'm just going to choose blue, so I have blue on blue. Okay, it looks kind of ugly, but the idea is that the selection changed. Okay, and then the follow-up to this is, if I'm looking at these list items, notice they take up the full width of the screen. Those list items, I want you to start taking note of all of these elements, whether it's changing background colors or putting borders on them or just positioning things next to them. Take notice of, is this an inline element or is it a block element? And since these list items are going the full width of the screen, those list items are block elements. Okay, I can change that. So if that's not the behavior that I want, so if I want those list items to be inline elements, I can change the display to be inline. And now you'll notice that it looks quite a bit different. Okay, not necessarily the way I want them to be, or kind of not necessarily their natural display. And since it's not their natural display, I'm going to get rid of that. And then you'll notice that the list changes quite a bit. Okay, so really what I'm talking about with these style rules is not necessarily to make it look nice or anything like that. Really what we're talking about is, how do I select an element to style it? And if it's a single element that I want to style and it's unique on the page, then typically I'm going to use the ID attribute in conjunction with an ID CSS selector to style that element. If it's a group of elements that I want to all have the same style and the same style rules, then typically I'm going to use a class attribute. So here's the class attribute. And then I can apply it to multiple items. So I have the class attribute applied to multiple items, and then I'm going to use that class selector to say, this is how I want those items styled. Okay, so at this point, I really want you to start to take notice in CSS. We can select all of the tags using a tag name. We can select an individual element by using an ID selector. Or we can select a group of elements that are similar or should be styled similarly using a class selector. Okay, so those three different selectors are going to come into play throughout this course.